Section 9 of Manners, Customs and Dress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Manners, Customs and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period, by Paul Lacroix. Section 9. Food and Cookery. History of bread, vegetables and plants used in cooking, fruits, butcher's meat, poultry, game, milk, butter, cheese and eggs, fish and shellfish, beverages, beer, cider, wine, sweet wine, refreshing drinks, brandy. Cookery. Soups, boiled food, pies, stews, salads, roasts, grills. Seasoning, truffles, sugar, verjuice. Sweets, desserts, pastry. Meals and feasts. Rules of serving at table from the 15th to the 16th centuries. The private life of a people, says Le Grand d'Aussy, who had studied that of the French from a gastronomic point of view only, from the foundation of monarchy down to the 18th century, must, like that of mankind generally, commence with obtaining the first and most pressing of its requirements. Not satisfied with providing food for his support, man has endeavoured to add to his food something which pleased his taste. He does not wait to be hungry, but he anticipates that feeling and aggravates it by condiments and seasonings. In a word, his greediness has created on this score a very complicated and widespread science, which amongst nations which are considered civilized has become most important, and is designated the culinary art. At all times the people of every country have strained the nature of the soil on which they lived by forcing it to produce that which it seemed destined ever to refuse them. Such food as human industry was unable to obtain from any particular soil or from any particular climate, commerce undertook to bring from the country which produced it. This caused Rabelais to say that the stomach was the father and master of industry. We will rapidly glance over the alimentary matters which our forefathers obtained from the animal and vegetable kingdom, and then trace the progress of culinary art, and examine the rules of feasts and such matters as belong to the Epicurean customs of the Middle Ages. Aliments. Bread. The Gauls, who principally inhabited deep and thick forests, fed on herbs and fruits, and particularly on acorns. It is even possible that the veneration in which they held the oak had no other origin. This primitive food continued in use, at least in times of famine, up to the 8th century, and we find in the regulations of St. Chrodegand that if, in consequence of a bad year, the acorn or beech nut became scarce, it was the bishop's duty to provide something to make up for it. 8 centuries later, when René du Bellay, Bishop of Mans, came to report to Francis I the fearful poverty of his diocese, he informed the king that the inhabitants in many places were reduced to subsisting on acorn bread. In the earliest times bread was cooked under the embers. The use of ovens was introduced into Europe by the Romans, who had found them in Egypt. But, notwithstanding this importation, the old system of cooking was long after employed, for in the 10th century Rimbaud, abbot of the monastery of Saint Thierry near Reims, ordered in his will that on the day of his death bread cooked under the embers, panes subcinericios, should be given to his monks. By feudal law the lord was bound to bake the bread of his vassals, for which they were taxed, but the latter often preferred to cook their flour at home in the embers of their own hearths, rather than to carry it to the public oven. It must be stated that the custom of leavening the dough by the addition of a ferment was not universally adopted amongst the ancients. For this reason, as the dough without leaven could only produce a heavy and indigestible bread, they were careful, in order to secure their loaves being thoroughly cooked, to make them very thin. These loaves served as plates for cutting up the other food upon, and when they thus became saturated with the sauce and gravy, they were eaten as cakes. The use of the tourteaux, small crusty loaves, which were at first called tranchoirs, and subsequently tailloirs, remained long in fashion even at the most splendid banquets. Thus, in 1336, the Dauphin of Vienna, Humbert II., had, besides the small white bread, 4 small loaves to serve as tranchoirs at table. The Ménagier de Paris mentions des pains de trancheur half a foot in diameter and 4 fingers deep, and Froissart, the historian, also speaks of tailloirs. It would be difficult to point out the exact period at which leavening bread was adopted in Europe, but we can assert that in the Middle Ages it was anything but general. Yeast, which, according to Pliny, was already known to the Gauls, was reserved for pastry, and it was only at the end of the 16th century that the bakers of Paris used it for bread. At first the trades of miller and baker were carried on by the same person. The man who undertook the grinding of the grain had ovens near his mill, which he let to his lord to bake bread, when he did not confine his business to persons who sent him their corn to grind. At a later period public bakers established themselves, who not only baked the loaves which were brought to them already kneaded, but also made bread which they sold by weight, and this system was in existence until very recently in the provinces. Charlemagne, in his Capitulaires (statutes), fixed the number of bakers in each city according to the population, and St. Louis relieved them, as well as the millers, from taking their turn at the watch, so that they might have no pretext for stopping or neglecting their work, which he considered of public utility. Nevertheless, bakers as a body never became rich or powerful. It is pretty generally believed that the name of boulanger, baker, originated from the fact that the shape of the loaves made at one time was very like that of a round ball. But loaves varied so much in form, quality, and consequently in name, that in his Dictionary of Obscure Words, the learned Ducange specifies at least 20 sorts made during the 12th and 13th centuries, and amongst them may be mentioned the court loaf, the pope's loaf, the knight's loaf, the squire's loaf, the peer's loaf, the varlet's loaf, etc. The most celebrated bread was the white bread of Chailly or Chilly, a village 4 leagues (10 miles) south of Paris, which necessarily appeared at all the tables of the élite of the 14th century. The pain mollet, or soft bread made with milk and butter, although much in use before this, only became fashionable on the arrival of Marie de Medici in France, 1600, on account of this Tuscan princess finding it so much to her taste that she would eat no other. The ordinary market bread of Paris comprised the rousset bread, made of meslin and employed for soup, the bourgeoisie bread, and the chaland, or customer's bread, which last was a general name given to all descriptions which were sent daily from the neighbouring villages to the capital. Amongst the best known varieties we will only mention the corbeille bread, the dog bread, the bread of 2 colours, which last was composed of alternate layers of wheat and rye, and was used by persons of small means. There was also the Gonesse bread, which has maintained its reputation to this day. The table loaves, which in the provinces were served at the tables of the rich, were of such a convenient size that one of them would suffice for a man of ordinary appetite, even after the crust was cut off, which it was considered polite to offer to the ladies, who soaked it in their soup. For the servants an inferior bread was baked, called common bread. In many counties they sprinkled the bread, before putting it into the oven, with powdered linseed, a custom which still exists. They usually added salt to the flour, excepting in certain localities, especially in Paris, where, on account of its price, they only mixed it with the expensive qualities. The wheats which were long most esteemed for baking purposes were those of Brie, Champagne, and Bassigny, while those of the Dauphiné were held of little value, because they were said to contain so many tares and worthless grains that the bread made from them produced headache and other ailments. An ancient chronicle of the time of Charlemagne makes mention of a bread twice baked, or biscuit. This bread was very hard and easier to keep than any other description. It was also used, as now, for provisioning ships or towns threatened with a siege, as well as in religious houses. At a later period, delicate biscuits were made of a sort of dry and crumbling pastry, which retained the original name. As early as the 16th century, Reims had earned a great renown for these articles of food. Bread made with barley, oats, or millet was always ranked as coarse food, to which the poor only had recourse in years of want. Barley bread was, besides, used as a kind of punishment, and monks who had committed any serious offence against discipline were condemned to live on it for a certain period. Rye bread was held of very little value, although in certain provinces, such as Lyonnais, Forez, and Auvergne, it was very generally used among the country people, and contributed, says Bruyérin Champier in his treatise De Re Cibaria, to preserve beauty and freshness amongst women. At a later period, the doctors of Paris frequently ordered the use of bread made half of wheat and half of rye, as a means of preserving the health. Black wheat or buckwheat, which was introduced into Europe by the Moors and Saracens when they conquered Spain, quickly spread to the northern provinces, especially to Flanders, where by its easy culture and almost certain yield, it averted much suffering from the inhabitants, who were continually being threatened with famine. It was only later that maize or turkey wheat was cultivated in the south, and that rice came into use. But these two kinds of grain, both equally useless for bread, were employed the one for fattening poultry, and the other for making cakes, which, however, were little appreciated. Vegetables and plants used in cooking. From the most ancient historical documents we find that at the very earliest period of the French monarchy, fresh and dried vegetables were the ordinary food of the population. Pliny and Columella attribute a Gallic origin to certain roots, and among them onions and parsnips, which the Romans cultivated in their gardens for use at their tables. It is evident, however, that vegetables were never considered as being capable of forming solid nutriment, since they were almost exclusively used by monastic communities when under vows of extreme abstinence. A statute of Charlemagne, in which the useful plants which the emperor desired should be cultivated in his domains are detailed, shows us that at that period the greater part of our cooking vegetables were in use, for we find mentioned in it fennel, garlic, parsley, shallot, onions, watercress, endive, lettuce, beetroot, cabbage, leeks, carrots, artichokes, besides long beans, broad beans, peas or Italian vetches, and lentils. In the 13th century the plants fit for cooking went under the general appellation of aigrun, and amongst them at a later date were ranked oranges, lemons, and other acid fruits. St. Louis added to this category even fruits with hard rinds, such as walnuts, filberts, and chestnuts; and when the Guild of the Fruiterers of Paris received its statutes in 1608, they were still called vendors of fruits and aigrun. The vegetables and cooking plants noticed in the Ménagier de Paris, which dates from the 14th century, and in the treatise De Obsoniis of Platina, the name adopted by the Italian Bartholomew Sacchi, which dates from the 15th century, do not lead us to suppose that alimentary horticulture had made much progress since the time of Charlemagne. Moreover, we are astonished to find the thistle placed among choice dishes, though it cannot be the common thistle that is meant, but probably this somewhat general appellation refers to the vegetable marrow, which is still found on the tables of the higher classes, or perhaps the artichoke, which we know to be only a kind of thistle developed by cultivation, and which at that period had been recently imported. About the same date melons begin to appear, but the management of this vegetable fruit was not much known. It was so imperfectly cultivated in the northern provinces that in the middle of the 16th century Bruyérin Champier speaks of the Languedocians as alone knowing how to produce excellent sucrins. Thus called, say both Charles Estienne and Liébault in the Maison Rustique, because gardeners watered them with honeyed or sweetened water. The watermelons have never been cultivated but in the south. Cabbages, the alimentary reputation of which dates from the remotest times, were already of several kinds, most of which have descended to us. Amongst them may be mentioned the apple-headed, the Roman, the white, the common white head, the Easter cabbage, etc. But the one held in the highest estimation was the famous cabbage of Senlis, whose leaves, say an ancient author, when opened, exhaled a smell more agreeable than musk or amber. This species no doubt fell into disuse when the plan of employing aromatic herbs in cooking, which was so much in repute by our ancestors, was abandoned. By a strange coincidence, at the same period as marjoram, caraway seed, sweet basil, coriander, lavender, and rosemary were used to add their pungent flavour to sauces and hashes, on the same tables might be found herbs of the coldest and most insipid kinds, such as mallows, some kinds of mosses, etc. Cucumber, though rather in request, was supposed to be an unwholesome vegetable, because it was said that the inhabitants of Forez, who ate much of it, were subject to periodical fevers, which might really have been caused by noxious emanation from the ponds with which that country abounded. Lentils, now considered so wholesome, were also long looked upon as a doubtful vegetable. According to Liébault, they were difficult to digest and otherwise injurious. They inflamed the inside, affected the sight, and brought on the nightmare, etc. On the other hand, small fresh beans, especially those sold at Landit fair, were used in the most delicate repasts. Peas passed as a royal dish in the 16th century, when the custom was to eat them with salt pork. Turnips were also most esteemed by the Parisians. This vegetable is to them, says Charles Estienne, what large radishes are to the Limousin. The best were supposed to come from Maison, Vaugirard, and Aubervilliers. Lastly, there were 4 kinds of lettuces grown in France, according to Liébault, in 1574. The small, the common, the curled, and the Roman. The seed of the last named was sent to France by François Rabelais when he was in Rome with Cardinal du Bellay in 1537, and the salad made from it consequently received the name of Roman salad, which it has ever since retained. In fact, our ancestors much appreciated salads, for there was not a banquet without at least 3 or 4 different kinds. Fruits. Western Europe was originally very poor in fruits, and it only improved by foreign importations, mostly from Asia by the Romans. The apricot came from Armenia, the pistachio nuts and plums from Syria, the peach and nut from Persia, the cherry from Cerasus, the lemon from Media, the filbert from the Hellespont, and chestnuts from Castana, a town of Magnesia. We are also indebted to Asia for almonds. The pomegranate, according to some, came from Africa, to others from Cyprus, the quince from Sidon in Crete, the olive, fig, pear, and apple from Greece. The statutes of Charlemagne show us that almost all these fruits were reared in his gardens, and that some of them were of several kinds or varieties. A considerable period, however, elapsed before the finest and more luscious productions of the garden became, as it were, almost forced on nature by artificial means. Thus, in the 16th century, we find Rabelais, Charles Estienne, and La Framboisière, physician to Henry IV., praising the Corbeil peach, which was only an inferior and almost wild sort, and describing it as having dry and solid flesh, not adhering to the stone. The culture of this fruit, which was not larger than a damask plum, had then, according to Champier, only just been introduced into France. It must be remarked here that Jacques Coitier, physician to Louis XI., in order to curry favour with his master, who was very fond of new fruits, took as his crest an apricot tree, from which he was jokingly called Abri Coitier. It must be owned that great progress has been made in the culture of the plum, the pear, and the apple. Champier says that the best plums are the Royal, the Perdricant, and the Damas of Tours. Olivier de Serres mentions 18 kinds, amongst which, however, we do not find the celebrated Reine Claude, greengage, which owes its name to the daughter of Louis XII., first wife of Francis I. Of pears, the most esteemed in the 13th century were the Astivaux, which was an early sort, and no doubt the golden pear now called Saint Jean; the Caillou or Chaillou, a hard pear, which came from Caillou in Burgundy, and l'Angoisse, agony, so called on account of its bitterness, which, however, totally disappeared in cooking. In the 16th century the palm is given to the cuisse dame, or madame, the bon chrétien, brought, it is said, by Saint François de Paule to Louis XI., the bergamote, which came from Bergamo in Lombardy, the thym bonne, so named from its aroma, and the caillou rosa, our rosewater pear. Amongst apples, the blanc dureau, hard white, of Auvergne, the Rouveau, and the Paradis of Provence are of oldest repute. This reminds us of the couplet by the author of the Street Cries of Paris, 13th century. Prime et pomme de Rouviot, et d'Auvergne le blanc duriot. Give me first the russet apple and the hard white fruit of Auvergne. The quince, which was so generally cultivated in the Middle Ages, was looked upon as the most useful of all fruits. Not only did it form the basis of the farmers' dried preserves of Orléans, called cotignac, a sort of marmalade, but it was also used for seasoning meat. The Portugal quince was the most esteemed, and the cotignac of Orléans had such a reputation that boxes of this fruit were always given to kings, queens, and princes on entering the towns of France. It was the first offering made to Joan of Arc on her bringing reinforcements into Orléans during the English siege. Several sorts of cherries were known, but these did not prevent the small wild or wood cherry from being appreciated at the tables of the citizens, whilst the cornouille, or wild cornelian cherry, was hardly touched, excepting by the peasants. Thence came the proverbial expression, more particularly in use at Orléans, when a person made a silly remark, "He has eaten cornelians," i.e., he speaks like a rustic. In the 13th century chestnuts from Lombardy were hawked in the streets, but in the 16th century the chestnuts of the Lyonnais and Auvergne were substituted, and were to be found on the royal table. 4 different sorts of figs, in equal estimation, were brought from Marseilles, Nîmes, Saint-Andéol, and Pont-Saint-Esprit, and in Provence filberts were to be had in such profusion that they supplied from there all the tables of the kingdom. The Portuguese claim the honour of having introduced oranges from China. However, in an account of the house of Humbert, Dauphin of Viennois, in 1333, that is, long before the expeditions of the Portuguese to India, mention is made of a sum of money being paid for transplanting orange trees. In the time of Bruyérin Champier, physician to Henry II., raspberries were still completely wild. The same author states that wood strawberries had only just at that time been introduced into gardens, by which, he says, they had attained a larger size, though they at the same time lost their quality. The vine, acclimatized and propagated by the Gauls, ever since the followers of Brennus had brought it from Italy 500 years before the Christian era, never ceased to be productive, and even to constitute the natural wealth of the country. In the 16th century, Liébault enumerated 19 sorts of grapes, and Olivier de Serres 24, amongst which, notwithstanding the eccentricities of the ancient names, we believe that we can trace the greater part of those plants which are now cultivated in France. For instance, it is known that the excellent vines of Thomery, near Fontainebleau, which yield in abundance the most beautiful table grape which art and care can produce, were already in use in the reign of Henry IV. In the time of the Gauls, the custom of drying grapes by exposing them to the sun, or to a certain amount of artificial heat, was already known; and very soon after, the same means were adopted for preserving plums, an industry in which then, as now, the people of Tours and Rheims excelled. Drying apples in an oven was also the custom, and formed a delicacy which was reserved for winter and spring banquets. Dried fruits were also brought from abroad, as mentioned in the Book of Street Cries in Paris. Figues de Mélité sans fin, j'ai roisin d'outre-mer roisin. Figs from Malta without end, and grapes from over the sea. End of section 9.